Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for being with us for this conference on the topic of the religious lives of migrant minorities with the focus on Great Britain, Malaysia, and South Africa. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. The center is just a few years old, and we're really part of a university-wide effort to advance the interdisciplinary study of religion as it relates to global policy challenges of diplomacy, of development, and of dialogue. And I think you'll agree that one of the most interesting intersections in this space is that between globalization, migration, and religion. It's an intersection that I think is easier to theorize about than it is to truly understand in its particularity. And I think the members of this project may be coming back to this point over the course of the afternoon. What the project does, and this is a project sponsored by the Social Science Research Council, which is based in New York and is one of the premier supporters of interdisciplinary research. What the project does is combine sort of theoretical and comparative thinking about migration, globalization around the world with particular case studies. And it's a project that's been several years running, and you'll hear some more about it in a minute. I'm delighted, again, that you're here, that we have the SSRC as a partner. I'd also like to recognize the Henry Luce Foundation, which through the SFS Program on Religion and International Affairs has helped to make this conference possible, and also the co-sponsorship of the Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration, and Susan Martin, its director, is here beside me. So we have a good team together. I'm glad the Berkeley Center is participating in this important project in the person of Jose Casanova. And without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Josh DeWind, who's director of the SSRC's program on migration, and he'll provide an overview of the project.
I want to thank Tom Banchoff and the Berkeley Center for hosting this event and for hosting a workshop that we will have after the event to continue working on the ideas that we will present to you today. It's a pleasure for us to be here in Georgetown and have this opportunity. I briefly want to tell you a little bit about the background of the project and its focus, its concepts and methods that are behind it. But I should warn you that we've spent many years working on framing this research project, and we're only now coming to put together the findings from teams in different countries. And what you will hear today will be coherent in pieces and will hang together in part, but if you find discontinuities or inconsistencies, we hope that you will help us identify them, because that's what we're here to work on. And hopefully by the time we leave, we will have a more coherent understanding of what we've found. But we have very rich findings from different places and coming from different perspectives, and our job is to make sense out of it, and you're getting the first draft, in a sense, of our attempts to do so. And if you can help us revise that draft, that would be wonderful. First of all, we began thinking that there's been very little research and very little understanding of the relationship between migration, religion, and ethnic or migrant diversity in countries where migrants settle. And those three perspectives led to choosing a small team of people who have studied migration, studied religion, and studied diversity to help us put together a project to think about and to research these issues. The second stage of our project was to think about in thinking about a research project was to identify scales under which the relationship between migration, religion, and diversity take place. And it seemed clear to us that it happens in the lives of individuals, it happens in their communities, it happens nationally, and then increasingly important to us in framing this project, there's a global perspective that link together migration and religion and affect diversity within different sites, which led us to consider different sites in the world where the research ought to be pursued. I think there could have been many other choices, and so there's a certain amount of arbitrariness to ours. But we ended up with London, Kuala Lumpur, and Johannesburg as primary sites, although not specifically limited to only those cities in each site. And but it was the notion was that we would be looking at urban context shaped by national, within a national regime or national structures. In order to examine the intersection between religion and migration and diversity in each site, as a research project, we finally came to thinking that focusing on biographies or personal narratives of individuals would be the best way for us to get both at the religious and spiritual meaning as well as the physical and social meaning of migration and religion and when combined together. So we're not just looking from the outside, but from the inside and the perspectives of the migrants themselves. What meanings do they, religious meanings do they give to their migration? What is migration? How does it change their understanding of their religions? And we thought that by focusing on personal biographies, we could then look at the engagement of individuals in their family life, in their communities, in the nation, and then transnationally or globally. So it was a methodology that we chose in order to look at the different scales or different spheres within which we wanted to study the relationship between migration and religion. Another thing that we realized in the process of establishing the project is that when we look at migrant groups entering into the three sites, that in each case they entered and began as minorities. So thus we've included the minority status of migrants in the title of the project and in thinking about how religion and migration come together within specific sites. And the minority status is an important part of the migrants' self-perception as well as their experience and their appreciation or use of religious resources. Being a minority often motivates how they understand and use their religion, given the social status that they have. Finally, after we had, this is the third year of the research, we had a meeting about, I guess 9 months ago, something like that, when we were beginning to draft and structure how we would analyze the findings of research at each site. And we, although we talked about it before, we agreed upon an analytical structure that was specifically not intended to focus on the group, the migrant group identity or the religion as an entity, but rather to examine common processes that all groups all related to different religions would experience in common. Well, maybe not have the same experiences, but at least the same kinds of experiences and how they're structured. And we ended up with 3 themes to do that. And our presentations today will revolve around these themes. The first being the theme of journeys. The idea being that migrants undergo physical as well as spiritual journeys, and how do the individual narratives of those journeys relate to one another? The second is placemaking, which is the establishment of a place which is both physical in terms of migrant settlement, but also spiritual in the sense of a place of worship and being able to practice a religion. And the third theme is one of circulation, which is in some ways a way of once settlement. Well, this is one understanding of this theme, and we're still working on how these different themes differentiate from one another. But one understanding of this is that once a group has settled, they continue to have international connections through migration and through religious networks and structures. How do religious, given those transnational structures and networks, how do religious ideas, practices, and objects circulate? How do ideas come in and out of a place? How do religious leaders come in and out of a place of migrant settlement? How do practices come in and out? What are the connections that settled migrants have with their home countries and with global religions? So we wanted to not only, so in a sense what we've done is themes that are the process of migration, the settlement, and then the continuing connections that migrants have transnationally through both migration and religion. I think if you ask someone else to describe these themes, you'd get a somewhat different explanation, but we're working on coming up with a common understanding. I think that's all I need to tell you to orient you towards the project. First, you will hear from the three people whose responsibility is to coordinate the pulling together of the findings within each theme from the three different sites. So we are drafting a book, and like I said, you're in a sense getting the first draft presented to you. And so we'll begin with the theme of journeys that Jose Casanova will present. Jose is one of the scholars who's here at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. Then we'll hear from Manuel Vasquez, who comes from the Department of Religion at Florida University, who is coordinating the writing or the synthesis that we're pulling together on placemaking. And then finally, we'll hear from Kim Knott, who is an international advisor to our project, who comes from Leeds University in England, and she will be representing to you the synthesis that Peggy Levitt has been putting together on the question or the issues of circulation. I think that's all I need to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, as Tom mentioned, I'm Susan Martin. I direct the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown, and I'm really delighted to be moderating this first session and participating in the conference. Our institute and the Berkeley Center have done a number of events together, and this is the third year in which we've co-sponsored a conference that deals with issues of religion, migration, and international relations. And I certainly look forward to continuing to work with the Berkeley Center on a set of issues that I think are of equal importance, whether you come into them from the migration policy and studies point of view, as we do, or from the religion and international affairs point of view, as does the Berkeley Center. It's my job to move along the discussions in this first session on the cross-site comparative reflections. Josh has already introduced the speakers and what they'll be focusing on. They'll each be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes so that we can have some time for discussion. We almost have caught up to the agenda, but I think that if we need to go on for a few minutes longer, we'll work into the break. But let me start with Jose Casanova and ask him to present his comments on migrant and spiritual journeys.
Thank you. As you saw, it is even difficult to move 20 people on time, so we were late. Imagine what it means to get 20 people in 3 different cities around the world, and advisors and coordinators and all kinds of levels of working together, very interdisciplinary in terms of religious studies, different social sciences, historians. So it has been a very interesting learning process, and we are learning. As Josh said, this is really the kind of preliminary presentation of what we'll be working through this weekend, the workshop. Let me simply say one thing about the sites, in the sense that originally we had expected also to incorporate an American city, either New York or Atlanta. Simply it became too expensive for the foundation to finance, so we had to leave aside the American cities that had already been studied in a series of the Pew-funded Gateway City projects. But the idea of the project was to go a little further away from the usual comparisons of US and Europe and to go beyond Western-centric kind of comparisons of immigration and look for places with a long history, both of migrations and also encounters of Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and at different regimes, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. So in the different cities, as I will point out with the journeys, we have different levels, layers of sedimentation, of immigration that enter into the narrative. Sometimes you have some of the immigrants who are studying are just new arrivals within the last 20 years. Others may have already been second, third generation going back to colonial immigration under the British colonial system. In fact, what unites the 3 cities, of course, that they were part of the British colonial system. And indeed, some of these migrations were the kind of labor migration that the British Empire moved from the subcontinent to either Malaysia or South Africa. So there are some interesting connections. Now about journeys, it's obvious that, that migration is a journey, of course, is a truism, is moving from one place to another. And of course, any social science of migration has to study all the dimensions of the journeys, demographic, the geopolitical, let's say political, economic, media, all kinds of the regimes of migration, regimes of human rights, all kinds of structural factors have to be taken into account. We do take all these structural factors as a background information that we need to use to inform our study, but we decided precisely to have not the objectifying gaze and studying migration externally, but trying to get into the phenomenological experience of migration through the narratives that migrants construct about their own journeys. And these narratives sometimes are really about their own journeys, individual journeys, but sometimes are collective, family, group narratives that have, again, different layers of composition and that have been rewritten again and again as their both urban and national context has been transformed historically. So migrations that came through the colonial system, let's say in South Africa, then you have the apartheid regime, the post-apartheid, and the same groups, their narratives of how their collective journeys were linked to these transformations is part of the story we also want to tell. In looking at the kind of journeys, we are particularly interested precisely in the examining the phenomenologically and narratively mediated interaction between migration and religion. How and to which extent do religious resources, namely beliefs and practices, discourses and dispositions, identities and communities, traditions and networks, sacred spirits and material objects affect, shape, or condition the migratory journey from beginning to settlement and then its subsequent narrations. Because the interesting thing is how within the same narration you have all kinds of aspects that change depending upon the historical moment and the period. And then how does the migratory journey in turn affect and transform migrant religions in all the above mentioned dimensions? How are migratory and spiritual journeys related? And the question whether migratory journeys tend to call forth or facilitate individual and collective journeys of conversion and mission, purification and revival, faithfulness or declension. And because we are looking at so many different groups at three very different sides, what we find ourselves is that we are juxtaposing, contrasting, superimposing, and comparing precisely very different narratives of very different groups. And these narratives can be grouped into four different categories. So we have a lot of narratives, and you could, of course, put them in whichever framework you want, or place them in different frameworks. We've decided, we are working on this principle, that we can organize them around four different categories. One, there is a narrative genre which is almost, you could say, universal and almost eternal, part of the human condition, the migratory journey that has the two main narrative modes of displacement, exile, loss, basically, and you have the uprootedness of the migration experience, leaving one home, leaving one's place, and then opening to a completely unknown world. And so you have this story of loss and displacement, of course, is more prominent in some groups than others. On the other hand, you have the narrative of settlement, of finding, if you wish, even the promised land, exodus to the promised land, or progress, betterment, improvement. And most narratives, both individual and collective, share elements of both, depending again upon which experience. Usually the first moment on the narrative, the most recent, are the experience of displacement, which is dominant, and then eventually comes the narrative of either progress, improvement, settlement, if it happens. But what we found interesting is how these narratives themselves change and may go from one to another. And even within the same groups, you have historical changes that make the narrative change. So this is the first way of grouping the narratives. And as I said, those are kind of general narratives that you find probably across time and space in the experience of migration. The most common, for instance, the story of displacement of indentured labor from India in South Africa, and how the colonial, if you wish, both displacement and exploitation, and then through the apartheid system and so on. So this is one typical story that comes across. In South Africa, you have the most recent story of displacement, which of course the Somali refugees is another of the groups that we are studying. You'll be hearing later when in the second panel, you will hear about the Somali refugees. So those are again the two typical groups, and we follow this story of displacement. We could give you examples of the story of progress that both individual and groups, as they settle and found a place in their new homes. Let's say the Chinese narrative of migration in Kuala Lumpur, you will be hearing also of this story. But this is not the interesting one. This is the one that basically you've heard every study of migration has dealt with these two aspects. A second aspect of grouping is precisely the relation between migratory and spiritual journeys, to which extent the migrants themselves use religious language, religious discourse to interpret, to understand, or to express their own experience, and then how actually they link the fact or the phenomenon of migration to some spiritual journey, either mission or conversion or the kind of purification and transformation of the religious tradition that is involved. And here it is, for instance, the very dominant phenomenon in South Africa of how many pastors who come there with a mission to serve communities. They come alone as individuals. So they are migrants, but migrants with clearly a mission to become ministers, either to people of their own country, their own migrations, but sometimes pastors that may come from Kenya, Pastor Susan, and that comes and actually to become a minister to a kind of a very much disprivileged native South African community in the kind of the very margin of one of the most marginal townships in Johannesburg. So, and again, what interests us is to which extent this linking of the migratory, the spiritual journeys has specific linguistic codes, tropes that are specific to Christianity, to Islam, to Hinduism, to Chinese ethnic or Chinese religion, although as we know it's not as differentiated as the others, or Hindu. So the idea to which extent Dawah or Hajira, the pilgrimage, or the born-again purification, the way in which those tropes from specific linguistic codes are the kind of the framing which the migrants themselves use to make sense of their lives and of their journeys. And here, of course, we'll hear from especially from the Kimbangista migration, how much the migration of the Kimbangists from Congo is very much related also to their mission to become ambassadors of their religion and of their message. So this is the second way of ordering the journeys. The third is when these narratives are very clearly contextually related and shaped by the very, very different sides, and how, let's say, the experience of Kuala Lumpur or Johannesburg or London shape the narratives, because since we are dealing with religious migrant minorities, the relations between minorities to majorities, and the relations to minorities to other minorities, which kind of regime of religious pluralism exists in the different places, which kind of regimes of, if we secular versus religious. I mean, a Muslim majority defining the Malay nation is very different from a Christian majority, a Christian secular majority defining the British or the English nation. So the way in which the narratives of each of the migrant minorities becomes interconnected with the narratives of other migrant minorities. So we study, if you wish, the encounters of migrant minorities with one another and the minorities with the majorities through the way in which their narratives, the narrative of the minorities incorporated or not into the narrative of the nation as a whole, or how precisely the narrative of the nation changes by incorporating the narratives of the immigrant minorities. And this is something which in the three cases, particularly in the case of Johannesburg and Kuala Lumpur, let's say, South Africa and Malaysia, very clearly the histories of the narrative of the nation or of the people in pre-colonial, in apartheid or post-colonial Malay, and then the new kind of unsettling. There had been already settlements that had worked for a period of time, and then they become destabilized again today under new conditions of globalization. So this is, again, the kind of narratives of religious narratives that are linked to the particular context. And then we look at the fourth type of narratives, those which are more specifically related to the contemporary moment of globalization. Namely, there are some, as we mentioned, some narratives that maybe, let's say the Pentecostals, when they talk about their own mission, yes, may, for instance, refer to the typical tropes of the apostles, or of the conversion of the road to Damascus, go to the world and evangelize to all the peoples. And so they may tell you the reference that, yes, our mission now is to bring Christianity back to the colonial metropolis. Let me actually give you a very nice quote from missionaries, yes, but they distorted the message. They rejected the real message. That is the problem, and we are where we are now. God has never forgotten its people. Now evangelization is going in the opposite direction. Evangelism from below. It is now the Africans, the Asians, who are coming to Europe with God's message. Europe has sown, now it is the harvest. Europe is harvesting what they sown. And this is a Congolese Pentecostalist in London. Again, you will have different kind of discourses from Muslims. But what we found as an interesting component of the particular moment is the way in which these circulations, these flows, discursive, but also of groups through global migration, you have these communications. Sometimes you may have the same group. Kimbangi is going to London and to Johannesburg, and that becomes interesting. There's the different countries make a difference, or you have exactly the same kind of discourse. But equally interesting is the way in which Hindu discourses become globalized, linking the India and the diasporic Hindu communities into a common and commonly constructed global discourse. The same goes for the globalized Ummah and the different Muslim discourse circulating across the different sites. So again, through the narrative, self-presentation, construction of identities of the migrant minorities, we are trying to look at, if you wish, these aspects of migration which are general and you could say across time and spaces, those which are unique to each religious discourse without essentializing the religion. We avoided trying to study Islam, evangelical Protestantism, and Hinduism or Buddhism as the subject of analysis. We wanted to study migrants themselves and the way in which their religious identities are then narrated, or again, the comparison of the sites and the kind of contemporary, unique, global present that informs also many of the discourses across sites. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll do all three presentations and open it up for discussion. So, Manuel.
Thank you very much for, it's nice to be back in Georgetown after 25 years. So why is it that space is so important for us? Especially because the social sciences, as geographer Edward Soja says, is guilty of what he calls a space-blinkered historicism. In its drive to liberate humanity from the imposition of control from outside rational self, the Enlightenment, which was the source of the critical social sciences, construed space as part of nature, as an external material limit to be transcended, or at a minimum, civilized through human action. So space was considered to be inert. Basically, space was considered to be something to be harnessed by human practice as individuals transform nature, including human nature, into culture and society. So we depart from the assumption that space is agentic. That is, that space is not inert, but rather that it is connected to time, and that it's dialectical. That is, that it's all about landscape. That is, landscape is a term that allows us to think about how space conditions and structures practices, but at the same time is conditioned and structured by practice. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at what I would call position spatial generativity by immigrants. That is, what do immigrants do as they are located in particular places? And what they do is constrained, but it's also enabled by those places. Okay. So our prism will also be multiscalar and relational, focusing on what Doreen Massey, geographer Doreen Massey, terms overlapping envelopes of space and time. According to her, and I quote, space is, quote, constructed out of interrelations as the simultaneous coexistence of social interrelations and interactions at all spatial scales, from the most local to the most global. So, while placemaking is crucially about what Thomas Tweed calls dwelling, it is also about mapping, building, and inhabiting at various scales. And it is also inextricably connected with mobility, particularly with journeys and circulation, which are the focus of the other sections of the volume that we're putting together. So that's kind of the epistemological assumption. A second epistemological assumption is that space has changed, even though space has always been dynamic. With the recent episode of globalization, in which migration plays a central part, it has become necessary and possible to adopt a multiscalar approach, understanding of space. So, as David Harvey says, we've had a time and space compression, which is complemented by what Anthony Giddens describes as a time and space distanciation. These two things are unsettling the cognitive maps that we have, and immigrants themselves are part of that mobility, and they have to draw from their religious resources to make sense of that cognitive unsettling. All right. So those are the assumptions that we make. And given those assumptions, I'm working out of 3 different drafts here. The study then will explore the cross-cutting, intersecting spatial dynamics that range from emplacement of the body through dance, scarification, conversion, and spirit incorporation, and the construction of household and community spaces as spaces of livelihood, to the articulation of ethnic, national, and transnational and diasporic identities. So we have the whole range of scales. We're interested in more than simply providing a phenomenology of religion, of religious placemaking in Kuala Lumpur and Johannesburg. We seek to compare and contrast practices across sites as a way to throw into relief the spatial interactions between migration and religion. Now, in order to undertake this comparison, I will briefly locate our cities within evolving spatial regimes, that is, relatively stable but always contested modes of spatial organization, which give rise and regulate such distinctions as those between sacred and secular, the public and the private, the visible and the invisible, the native and the stranger. Spatial regimes accompany different forms of governmentality, to draw from Michel Foucault, that correspond to colonial, national/post-national, neo-imperial, or multi-local periods. Actually, we don't know how to call this third period. We're sure that there's a colonial period. We're sure there's a national/post-national period. And then there's a new kind of episteme, spatial episteme, which I'm calling neo-imperial or perhaps multi-local. I am not sure that that's the term that we want to use. Each period is characterized by discursive and non-discursive techniques that, as part of a larger biopolitics, shape differentially the ways in which immigrants build their identities, relate to each other, and to the native populations in space. In turn, religion is a key medium through which immigrants negotiate spatial regimes in everyday life. More specifically, religion provides the resources to craft moral and effectively charged maps that not only reflect but also buttress the logic of special regimes, and in addition, they may offer tools to challenge these special regimes, introducing heterogeneity by building alternative utopias. So, this is the kind of theoretical framework that sort of informs our notion of placemaking. But I want to say something about particular places that we've studied, using the term that sociologist Nancy Eastland uses to talk about religious ecologies, that they are embedded in particular places. Let's start with Kuala Lumpur and Kajang. And here I'm thankful to Diana Wong, who has provided a lot of the language for this particular spatial regime. In order to make sense of the current organization of religious and ethnic space in Kuala Lumpur and Kajang, it is necessary to understand the logic of the colonial spatial regime, which was embodied in a land code that legally located physical spaces around which collective religious activities took place. Two public spaces stand out for their role in building migrant identities and marking ethnic belonging, as well as preserving diasporic memories. Those are temples and burial sites. Immigrants to Malay in the 19th and 20th century brought a variety of different faiths with them, often from within the same ethnic group. The British colonial administration sought to manage this diversity through an Enlightenment-based secularized regime that combined the establishment of tolerance for religious pluralism. More specifically, the regime officially patronized the Anglican and Presbyterian churches and made Islam an official religion under the jurisdiction of the Sultan of each state. But otherwise, it maintained a policy of open neutrality, allowing all new incoming faiths transported by immigrants space for public expression. In order to maintain the balance between religious hegemony and tolerance, which I think is what really characterizes this spatial regime, the colonial regime introduced a land code under which physical space for religious worship and burial had to be legally gazetted as such. Land was made available freely. Religious placemaking by immigrants, communities thus was very much part of the production of locality in the public space of the emerging nation state. So that's the colonial regime. What about today? The colonial regime has been replaced by the present religious regime of an increasing Islamization of the state. So the key word here in the negotiation of space is the Islamizing state. This new regime is more overtly interested in the control of religious orthodoxy, particularly of the public visibility of religions other than Islam. As we shall see, in the case of Hinduism and Chinese religions, we'll see in the afternoon, later on in the afternoon, the institutionalized legitimacy of religions that are not religions of the book, that is, non-Abrahamic religions, is an especially contentious subject. In general, the migration regime of today also does not, as a rule, permit localizing or settlement. Contemporary immigrants, almost without exception, cannot engage in public religious placemaking. They have to seek their existing religious institutions, places of worship. For example, Indonesian workers go to the United Methodist Church? Mosque? No, UKM Church, Mosque. National, exactly, for Friday prayers. And Nigerian students go to the Assemblies of God. So the present religious regime, therefore, has transformed the dynamics of public religious placemaking for the existing non-Muslim communities of faith. given the tremendous growth in size of the urban population, especially in the last 3 decades, the demand for new sites of worship and burial has grown exponentially for all faiths across the board. And there's a formal bureaucracy at the state and national level to regulate the Islamic faith. But there's no legal framework, however, for establishing and managing the regulation of non-Islamic affairs. As a result, land for sites of worship and burial that fall under the planning regulations of the state has not been allocated for new religious minorities. The overall effect of the new religious regime in Kuala Lumpur is to limit the space for institutional expression of collective religious activity among migrant minorities, making all standing temples more central and thus increasing the status and prestige of leaders who run and maintain them. At the same time, we have an upward mobile class of second and third generation immigrants who have found ways to generate alternative public spaces, religious spaces, that escape the limitations imposed by Islamization. Finally, migrant minorities have come to rely on temporary public displays such as processions, marches, annual festivals to mark their collective religious identity and generate what Durkheim would call collective religious effervescence. So that's the map in Kuala Lumpur. Now let's go to Johannesburg. If in Malaysia, the special regime is strongly determined by the Islamization of the state, in South Africa, it is the precarious transition to a new post-apartheid dispensation that is shaping religious placemaking among migrant minorities. The apartheid special regime was based on racial segregation, supported by an evolutionary and organicist view of culture, which was typical of the colonial imaginaire. Each tribal group was thought to have its own self-contained culture that was isomorphic with language, racial characteristics, and the landscape in which it dwelled. This drastic territorialization of African populations was predicated on the fear of miscegenation, which in the eyes of the Afrikaner population threatened the purity and integrity of their race, culture, and religion. So to avoid this racial and cultural mixing, it was not only necessary to create separate and self-governing Bantustans, that is, homelands, but to regulate the circulation of people across them through a system of passed laws. Moreover, the concern for racial purity also led to the enactment of laws making sexual relations among persons of different racial groups not only immoral, but a criminal offense. And of course, there's the banning of marriage across racial groups. Now, Johannesburg is really interesting because it's a mining town, so there's a little bit of freewheeling going on. And of course, you have people coming in as early as the 1890s. You have black South Africans who were brought to work in the mines and were forced to live in precarious conditions in hostels away from their families. And shortly after that, you have Indians who have completed their period of indentured labor in Natal's sugar plantations that also begin to arrive in Johannesburg. Later on, you have the Gujaratis moving in, who are working in commerce and trade. And while some of the Indians who came to Johannesburg in the early days prospered in the transport business, they too were forced to live in separate, squalid conditions by the Transvaal anti-Indian laws. Okay. These land restrictions laid the groundwork for the growth in the 1940s of a whites-only central business district, ringed by inner residential areas such as Hillbrow, which became quickly populated by high-density and high-rise buildings. Now, what happens after the abolition of the Group Areas Act in 1991 as apartheid is being dismantled? It ushered a dramatic transformation of Johannesburg cartography. Black South Africans that had been forbidden to live in the CBD, in the Central Business District, begin to move into it in large numbers. They are accompanied by undocumented immigrants from countries in other parts of Africa, such as Angola, Zimbabwe, Burundi, Rwanda, and Mozambique, which have been affected around the time by political and economic turmoil. So that between 2001 and 2007, the province of Gauteng, I never got the pronunciation right, where Johannesburg is located, had a net immigration gain of almost 420,000 inhabitants. Yes. So there's a whole discussion we have here about what Lauren Landau, who is part of our team, calls the tactical cosmopolitanism of the new immigrants. But what I want to talk about that is that in response to the volatility and population shifts as people begin to move into the central business district, and the business and political elites move out of the city towards areas such as Randburg and Sandton, leaving behind a decaying infrastructure and a precarious social services, is that you have a liminal anomic situation. The breakdown of the old apartheid spatial order and the incipient and precarious nature of the new democratic dispensation force a kind of religious placemaking that focuses on the management of risk. That is, the question of bodily integrity and safety is central for immigrants, as well as the question of spiritual wholeness and purity. The key issue is how to navigate an environment that is perceived as dangerous, full of evil spirits, spirits that can lead to the migrants' moral and thus economic downfall. This overriding concern then explains the success of Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches, of which you will hear later on, which see themselves as engaged in a cosmic battle, an aggressive spiritual warfare against the devil and its minions, who are responsible for the ills of poverty and domestic violence and drug abuse that affect Black South Africans and immigrants alike. There's something here that I have to say about the pathologizing of Johannesburg. Johannesburg is always seen as a kind of pathological place, and we have to be careful about that. But I want to move into London quickly, and since I'm running out of time, I want to say something about the fact that London, what characterizes London as a particular place is that it's a city with an ancient history, an imperial past, that in the last 2 decades of the 20th century has emerged as a key command center and financial node for a new global flexible regime of capitalist accumulation. So as a result, you have what Steve Verdovic calls, I'm going to jump right into the characteristics right now, and I can talk more about the industrial and post-industrial spatial regime if you want, but for the purposes of advancing, I'm going to talk about what Verdovic calls superdiversity. The term superdiversity describes, in Verdovic's word, the diversification of diversity that renders increasingly untenable the traditional model of multiculturalism and religious pluralism, which was central to the imaginaire of modern London, and was built on the notion of self-contained, tightly territorialized, organically integrated ethnic groups. So you had the Bangladeshis here, you had the West Africans here, right? That was the model. But with super diversity, what you have is, quote, a dynamic interplay of variables among an increased number of new and small and scattered multiple origin, transnationally connected, socioeconomically differentiated, and legally stratified immigrants who have arrived over the last decade. So you have the shrinking of space because of the time and space compression, but you also have the diversification of immigration as people from Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East come into London, creating then a super diversity that challenges the cognitive maps that have been used in the city. So, as our case studies will demonstrate later on, superdiversity does not result in the erasure of space. Quite the contrary, as Frederick Jameson, Edward Soja, and David Harvey would argue, globalization's time and space compression incites a strong desire to find new cognitive maps that can help recenter self, family, and community. So for migrant minorities, religion plays a major role in the process of recentering and reinscribing space linking the personal and local with the transnational and global. In particular, religion provides some of the key idioms and practices to think and perform authenticity, purity, authority, moral legitimacy, and belonging at the local level vis-a-vis a liberal state in an imagined and also a real reference to diaspora. As in Johannesburg, religion in London serves as a mechanism to manage risk, to insulate the body against the powers of the unseen, the dangers of the uncharted. But while in Johannesburg, the most pressing threat is the everyday violence and fragile and temporary nature of social relations, in London, it is the baffling diversity of religions and lifestyles, as well as the profusion and speed of multiscalar flows that challenge the integrity and stability of self, family, and community, and makes it the city, in the words of a Kimbangist, the city, the capital of witchcraft. Because it's constantly moving, you don't know where spirits are coming from, you don't know the provenance of the spirits, you have to develop a set of strategies to identify and moralize, remoralize the space. You do that by converting old warehouses abandoned by the post-industrial regime, and you turn them into post-industrial spiritual districts where you provide all sorts of goods, religious goods, that allow for this recentering of self, community, and society. So, in other words, we have then three interesting spatial regimes that are particular in themselves, but are also show some interesting cross comparisons, which I hope that we can continue working out today and throughout the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kim.
Let's see if we can get this working. Are you really so much taller than me, Manuel? Surprising. Huh? You seem so much taller than me. Here, would you like that? Now, I am standing in for Peggy Levitt, who is the other coordinator in the project, and I am an international advisor. I'm actually from the UK. So as I speak, you have to imagine the beautiful and very talented Peggy Levitt sitting on my shoulder, because this is really her work and not mine. So my role is to really give you Peggy's take on the theme of circulation as it relates to the three places that we've heard about so articulately from Manuel. And I just wanted to mention, to begin with really, that this theme of circulation, it takes us from the place that Manuel was talking about, which was perhaps developing this notion of placemaking and dwelling, towards Tom Tweed's other notion of crossing, and from crossing into these circulations of various kinds that we see reference to in a lot of the theoretical literature around transnationalism, diasporas, globalization, and the work of scholars like Opaderai on flows, Manuel himself on networks, and increasingly on notions of multi and translocality. So although there's not a great deal out there to read specifically on circulation, it's in these theoretical areas that we find the evidence for this particular theme. I'm actually going to start by quoting a few words from Peggy just to get the Peggy spirit going. And this is from the beginning of something that she's written, an essay that she's written for the project. And she says, just as computers and cell phones have transformed the way we do business, so they're transforming the way the word travels. Christmas 2004 marked the first time that Italian Catholics could receive free video transmission of Pope John Paul's Midnight Mass and his Christmas Day message on their cell phones. In fact, the Holy See stays in touch with his faithful each day by texting the papal thought for the day to subscribers. The service available in Italy, Ireland, Malta, Britain, and the United States costs 30 cents a message. And Christians are not the only one taking advantage of these high-tech proselytizing techniques. The British-based Islamic Prayer Alert Service, which sends out 70,000 messages a month, reminds its subscribers when they're supposed to pray and inspires them with quotes from the Quran. Viewing faith as inherently mobile forces us to understand religions and their relationship to national culture in a different light. It also provides an opportunity to unpack processes of global cultural production, circulation, and consumption, to understand the people, networks, and objects that drive and are driven by religious movement and the ways in which faith is transformed in the process. As we know, religions have always been mobile, and in many respects, this is not looking at circulation in this context isn't a new thing for scholars of religion. But in this project, in respect of circulation, we've got two key aims: to develop an analytical strategy for understanding religious beliefs and practices in motion, and to use religion, we hope, to understand broader processes of global cultural production and consumption. And we've got a series of research questions, and these are, you heard a series of questions at the beginning from Jose about journeying, and these are the relevant ones, I think, with respect to circulation. What can we learn about how culture travels and gets used by studying religion? Is there something unique about the way religion traverses the globe that makes it different to politics or fashion? How does religion change as it moves? Can we identify discernible patterns of hybridization, creolization, synthesis, syncretization that arise when religions from different places encounter one another? And how are these patterns affected by particular spaces like those that Manuel's been talking about, particular flows and national contexts? We're not ready, by the way, to answer all these questions. But we hope maybe by the end of the weekend we will be taking a step further in answering some of them. What Peggy's done is to elaborate, to identify and elaborate 6 issues for consideration in respect of the theme of circulation. And I'm just going to say a very little about each one of these. I might focus on 1 or 2 more than the others. There's the 6. But I'll show you a slide for each one of these. So let me start with geographies of circulation. So our task really is to imagine a whole series of different kinds of geographies in which religious ideas, actors, and objects circulate. These geographies might be both real and imagined. They might be physical, social, and cultural geographies, and indeed past and present geographies. Is it actually possible to speak of different religious groups having different geographies of circulation? For example, the colleagues in the project who are working on the Kimbanguists in both London and South Africa, do the Kimbanguists offer a particular geography of circulation? Or what about the Taiwanese group and its circulation back and forth with Malaysia? Fo Guangshan? I probably haven't pronounced that very well, but do these religious groups have their own specific geographies of circulation? And if so, what can we learn from those? Can we model those and establish different patterns across different religions? Some of the useful concepts that we have when thinking about geographies of circulation include some that you'll be familiar with. So developing really out of the work of Appadurai, the notion of scapes, religioscapes, sacroscapes. There have been a variety of ways in which this notion has been taken forward, but also conceptions of networks and hubs which enable religious ideas to circulate, a notion of social field, the social field, which comes out of Peggy's own work with Nina Glick-Schiller, and increasingly notions of multi-locality and translocality, in which we see object ideas, people, leaders, and so on, circulating between localities of importance to them in different countries, in different nations, and even within a single nation state. Peggy reminds us that geographies of circulation they involve places that are not themselves virgin territories. What she means by this is that the places that we're thinking about, and indeed the circulations that occur between them, are not, they're already worked. They've already been traversed. And the locations in which people are stopping and settling before they circulate again, or from which goods and ideas are circulating, they're rutted and shaped by particular national histories and particular religious histories. And we have to bear all that in mind when we're thinking about these geographies. And she reminds us that it's not just physical circulations that we're thinking about, but indeed imagined ones and virtual circulations, all very important when we're thinking about religion. So we're not just thinking about the physical, but we're thinking very much about ethereal and virtual journeyings. What about understanding culture in motion? It's probably facile, but nevertheless important to remind ourselves that as cultures move, they transform themselves. They don't only transform themselves, but as they settle, as they move between places, they transform the very places that they enter. Whether that's through cultural innovations of various kinds, or whether it's through the routine processes of religious transmission between generations, those kind of changes and transformations take place. What about meanings as they move around? How is meaning actually deployed when circulating ideologies and strategies come into contact with one another? How is it translated and localized? How, for example, if we think about a proselytizing group moving between locations, sending its leaders, sending its pastors, how do those leaders and pastors locate and indigenize, vernacularize, as Peggy refers to it, their ideas and practices? How does that happen? Is it always successful? What enables it to be successful? In Peggy's own work, one of the things that she's worked on is thinking about the vernacularization of what she calls global frames. And she gives a good example of the global frame of human rights and the extent to which that particular frame has been, in some contexts, been enabled to be localized, but in others rejected. And she looks at the processes by which that occurs. When, why, and how do certain global ideas, or at least alien ideas of any kind, get taken up? How are they made to seem locally appropriate, even to the extent of appearing to be legitimated within a local framework of beliefs, values, and practices? She talks about the example of gender in her own essay, but we have many examples of gender and the way this works within the project itself. How do ideas about women's rights and women's appropriate behavior circulate in the cases that we're looking at within the project? How are they locally appropriated and contested? We see examples in the South African case, in the UK case, where notions of women's propriety are very significantly negotiated and contested. in the context of the circulation of ideas of what is appropriate for a woman in terms of behaviour, what's appropriate for her in terms of leadership and so on. There are, one of the more obvious aspects to thinking about circulation is the mechanisms and channels by which it occurs. Religions have traversed the globe by a variety of pathways. Individual ones, so individual pilgrims and migrants taking their religious ideas with them as they travel, but also global religious organizations that increasingly have moved via internet technology or the use of audiovisual means, ICTs and so on. Peggy also notes, and this is to quote very briefly from her, transnational corporations, flexible specialization and transnational supply chains in thinking about these channels and mechanisms of circulation. There are some wonderful examples from the project on the way in which media has been important in the circulation of certain ideas or norms or values from one site to another. There's one example from the South African case of a Hindi film shown in 1998 in Durban. It's called Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, and it had an amazing impact on the local Indian population, who you might be surprised to hear were not really very interested in Bollywood movies until this film arrived in Durban. The film itself became a vehicle for ideas about love and individual decision-making and self-sacrifice. How people encountered it and interpreted it was quite striking, in contrast to the failure of circulation of many more traditional Hindi films. It's just one example of very many about the way in which media can provide a channel and mechanism circulation. But it's important not to forget the more traditional media of circulation in the form of gurus and leaders, teachers of various kinds that make physical circulations around the globe to their various populations. What is it that's circulating? Perhaps the most obvious aspect of this is people and their journeys post-settlement. But we have to remember that organizations, ideas, material objects, and indeed spirits themselves are circulating. So there are many, many things to consider when we think about what it is that's actually making these circulatory movements, what it is that flows globally. But Peggy also refers to things ethereal, and she gives a couple of examples of, particularly in respect of religious authority and notions of piety, which travel around the globe as migrants move and as connections, transnational connections, are retained between migrant populations and their places of origin and their relatives and extended communities elsewhere. Furthermore, they're renegotiated as they travel. Things ethereal are renegotiated as they travel. So notions of religious authority are not the same from one place to another, even within the same broad religious framework or the same sectarian organization. They are locally negotiated and change and transform through that process of vernacularization. Peggy's fifth issue is the why, explaining the why of circulation and adoption. And what she's really asking here is, why do some things travel easily while others get blocked? So some things seem somehow or other to be almost universally applicable, localizable, whilst others seem somehow to be suitable and fitting to some locations and not to others. There are some very interesting examples in the project about the movement of spirits and the blocking of spirits as they move. We've heard how London seems to be the location of the satanic spirit, and so the blocking out or the creating a boundary between that satanic spirit and the Kimbanguist pious followers is very important, but also ensuring that when those followers are themselves caught up in trance and the spirit is circulating through them, that if it's a bad spirit, it's blocked. So we see very much these barriers or boundaries at work in the circulation of spirits. But we also see that at a national level, national policies, national structures and so on make various forms of migration circulation, whether it's of people or goods or even ideas, difficult at times. So these structures and boundaries can occur at all sorts of levels in respect of the way ideas, objects and people circulate and the way in which they're adopted. There's a few other things mentioned there that you can read for yourself, because the last slide is about the impact of the encounter. And this almost takes us beyond circulation itself, or it might at least seem to initially, because this is about where things come together, where they may be locally embedded, where at that point of vernacularization, where they may seem to be grounded. But at the same time, from that process may come multiple or hybrid identities, new mixes of various kinds, certainly contestation. And we have many examples in the project of the kind of contestation which can occur as ideas, people, objects circulate and come together, where the fit may not be good, where it may lead to some kind of may lead to a successful negotiation, but it may lead to a problematic contest of some kind or another. I'm just going to finish with a final word from Peggy about this process and about the relationship of religion to circulation specifically. She says, religion is one example of more general processes of global production and consumption. In this increasingly mobile, interconnected world where more and more people claim multiple memberships, how national political institutions and citizenship are transformed receives a lot of attention. But religions are also sites where the local, the national, and the global collide, and multiple identities and memberships are formed and expressed. Looking closely at the actual processes of cultural production and circulation, as we see in these in the many sites that we're looking at, this reveals a much more complex interactive picture. Human and material elements, spiritual elements as well, accumulated from all layers and sites of transnational social fields, coalesce in response to specific historical and political contexts. These produce new mixes, shifting and recombining form and content before they travel once again to be taken up or not anew. Thank you.
Maybe I'll get started to just begin the way you take the prerogative of the chair. This applies to the whole project, but it came to me in each of the presentations in different ways. But there seems at times to be a conflation of religion with race and nationality in terms of understanding these processes. What is it about religion per se that makes this a different set of issues to be looking at? And particularly in a place when you're thinking about journeys or places or circulation. It particularly came up, Manuel, in your remarks, because I kept trying to figure out what was religion and what was race, for example, in both Malaysia and South Africa, and somewhat in London as well.
I
think it's a great question. I would say that these categories are definitely not reducible to each other, right? So that's the first thing that you have to start with. However, they're not isolated from each other. So the trick is to try to find the ways in which they resonate with each other, they inform each other, they reinforce each other, and sometimes run against each other too. I guess the way to... Was there any particular case where you felt that this conflation was taking place in a way that wasn't enough analytically fleshed out?
Well, it really came up for me as you started talking about South Africa.
Okay.
That was the case, but then it sort of going back to the comments about Malaysia.
Yes.
And then London. It was also to what extent are the interchange between the space, religion, journeys affected by race as much as the nationality.
If you take the case of South Africa, I mean, there are, of course, theological basis for a certain kind of construction of racial identities. And the point that I was trying to make was that, in fact, placemaking was bound to the process of identity formation, and that identity formation was a racialized one, and was buttressed by religious discourses that emphasize the idea that cultures have to be territorialized and separated from each other. And so there was, in that case, the relationship between religion, race, and nationality is one of tight connection. In the case of London, I think because of the super diversity, I think that there is, in fact, I would argue that perhaps there can be linking sometimes of the question of race, religion, and nationality. That perhaps religion comes to stand as the marker for difference rather than race and nationality. Or sometimes religion and nationality come to stand for something. But I think that these are two different cases, ways in which these two terms relate to each other. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Simply, of course, historically, those, the case of Malaysia, the case of South Africa, were really systems, regimes of ethnization.
Yes.
To which extent it corresponds to religion. For some groups, yes. Let's say the Chinese ethnic and religion is not completely, it's much more complex, obviously. And the case of Islam itself, because it was a transnational Islam, not only Malay. So there is also dynamics of Islamization, which link it to Malay, but makes it. South Africa, obviously, you had the system was racialization. The extent to which it was linked to religion, but obviously the apartheid Calvinist religion was the same religion maybe of some of the groups. So the same religion was used both to impose apartheid by the Afrikaner, but also the same religion was used to contest it by, let's say, African groups. Yep. So, and then the fact that so many different within the African majorities and minorities, immigrants, which are all, let's say, black, but the religious diversity is so great internally, both in terms of diversities of Christianity and diversities of other religions. In South Africa, for instance, the question of Islam, to which extent it is Indian Islam, or Arabic Islam, or now an African Islam. So this is part of the contestation. So the issues is the extent to which we actually examine the process in which these religious and racial identities and ethnic identities are either constructed from above or from below, deconstructed, changed. So this is actually a moving target, and interesting is to see how these processes change across time and space and are dynamic processes.
I mean, my answer would be really that religion does some different things to ethnicity, and it functions in some different ways. There's been quite a debate about this over a number of generations, in fact. But I have one very useful quotation, not from Peggy. I mean, it actually comes from something she's written, but it's actually from the work of, or it refers to the work of Jackie Hagan, who works on Mexican migrants. And she has written, I think, a really nice book, which I actually saw only the other day for the first time. But this is just Peggy's account. She says, the book highlights how Central American and Mexican migrants rely on religion, their clergy, faith, cultural expressions, and everyday religious practices to endure the undocumented journey, including the decision to leave, the journey, and the arrival, and how they turn to their culture, faith, clergy, and everyday religious practices for kind of spiritual and psychological strength. Now, I think we can go too far with that kind of explanation, but clearly there is a way in which religion is seen to offer resources to migrants. I think the other thing is, and this probably also pertains to that London case, that religion can very often be picked up, has, I think, to some extent been picked up in the UK as a particular feature, particularly useful feature of identity to develop. That makes it sound rather, I can't think of the word that I want, but rather hard. It's rather a hard view to say that it's wielding religious resources can gain you access to, in competitions, in a sense, for secular resources, so economic resources, for access to certain types of civic status. And so religious identity in itself has become a very important identity to mobilize. So this is not at the individual level so much as at the group level, but religious resources are often relied upon, religious identity can be relied upon really to gain access to particular kinds of resources in a way that ethnic identity certainly wouldn't in the UK. I don't know if that makes sense.
And if I may add, because it is to the whole project, we've been struggling ourselves in terms of organizing the project, because on the one hand, we were looking at particular religious groups like Hindu, Christian, Muslims, and Chinese, the differentiation of religion, but we decided not to organize precisely the chapters, either in terms of groups, religious or ethnic, on purpose to avoid essentializing or reifying those categories. And we decided precisely to use these entry concepts where we can put all these different groups and religions together, precisely to avoid what appears otherwise too much of a reification of the categories.
Yes, Marjorie. And please introduce yourselves when you ask questions or make comments.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Anthropology. I have a question that involves the issue of religious intensification in various contexts. It was particularly triggered when Manuel was talking about Kuala Lumpur and issues of increasing restrictions and Islamization, so that certain kinds of religious spaces needed to become more unofficial and possibly driven underground. And then I realized that that kind of process of intensification is also going on, but maybe in other ways in your other cases. So if you could elaborate on that, and possible also the implication is not just intensification, but possibly radicalization and fundamentalization. But I don't necessarily want you to link it. You don't have to link it.
Do you want me to? Yeah, definitely. I would say, for example, in London, there is, we're looking, and here I think, Anne, you want to help me on this, but the whole idea of firewalking, for example, or body piercing seems to be a marker for the Tamil community there of a certain kind of purity and authenticity, so that it becomes a signifier of the purity of the community vis-a-vis the culture of the receiving culture, so that it becomes a part of the tourist gaze of London as an exotic location, as a location where you have this multicultural intensity expressed, but also as a marker in relation to the diaspora. So that we do hear things in London that are not done somewhere else, or we do them in a certain way that, the way in which it was done before, now things have changed in South India, right? So there are definitely cases of intensification in each of the places. The same thing can be argued in terms of the South African case, I think, with, the Somalis. So I think you're entirely right that this idea of intensification is definitely a process that cuts across the three sites.
If I may add, obviously we avoided from the very beginning to organize the project through the categories of either emerging global religious fundamentalism or the global resurgence of religion. So avoided the issue of secularization, not secularization. On purpose, we simply did not put it at the center of our project. But second, obviously we are aware, I mean, we come from, many of us do work on issue of religion and globalization. And so the extent to which there is an emerging global system of religions and how it is affected. So especially if we look at the contemporary dynamics as opposed to those historical dynamics. But very clearly first, we wanted to, when I said that we wanted to go beyond the obsession with Islam in the West, very clearly, and to look of places of encounter of Islam, Hinduism, Christianity in different regimes, to look places where Islam itself is the majority religion vis-a-vis other minorities, but is an important minority religion in the other places. So we wanted to avoid, on the one hand, the focus on fundamentalism, the focus on Islam, and the focus on some theory of the global resurgence of religion, and however, offer, I think, both interesting data and analytical perspectives precisely to look at those, the unavoidable question of there is something going on which is new in terms that certainly neither politicians nor social scientists had paid much attention, and then now we are all aware of it. And this is a way of somehow intervening in those debates, but more from the ground up and precisely from the perspective of the migrants, minorities. We really try to not so much develop general theories as try to use precisely the ethnographic comparative work to perhaps intervene in those debates, but in a more nuanced way.
I think I'm not going to attempt to answer this, but I think maybe there's an interesting issue around whether circulation increases or intensifies, if you see what I mean, whether the very process of circulation intensifies. And I think that's something I'd like to think about. I don't know the answer to it. But I wondered if that you had anything you would like to add on this point, because I think we're very keen to hear, if somebody makes a point, whether they have something they themselves would like to add. Is there anything that you'd like to add on it? I think it would be very useful for us to hear it.
Okay, one thought comes from the work of Uni Wicken, who has been working on honor killings in Europe and some of the ironies of intensification of what's happened to Muslim communities as they become more constricting on their women, for instance, if you want to get the gender angle in here, rather than less. And so on the one hand, we're all very interested in perfectly legitimate and really sometimes culturally very rich processes of hybridization, and yet there seems to be a kind of backlash that sometimes happens to migrant communities. And so my question really came out of the dangers of driving people underground or into corners, and also some of the purity angles of the discourse that happens as migrants are feeling unmoored.
I mean, I think it's very true that we are seeing, I think everybody's data is very rich in respect of issues of morality and contestation around particular values and norms. So I would think we will see something interesting coming out of the project in terms of some of these processes of intensification, and why they're actually happening. I think may be more difficult to explain, and whether we will see differences in particular sites, I don't know. But there's certainly, I know from the data that there should be quite a lot to address this particular issue.
In one of the categories that we have been using, the Thomas Blom-Hansen, who is the kind of organizer, the chair of the Johannesburg Research Project, has been using the category of purification, doing the way in which the Indian, Hindu, and Muslim communities, the colored people in the apartheid system and the colonial, that were a relatively related community with one another, and how this being together related communities, they have been split apart and been reoriented to global ummas. So there are processes of global reorganization of identities away from the local towards the global. There are transformations of the one we mentioned of Malaysia is a different one. Here it is the Malaysian state which is Islamizing. Mm-hmm. And then the reaction of the other minorities, non-Muslim, is of course a very different one from that of the Muslim minorities that are conscripted, let's say, in secular Christian Europe. So again, it's interesting to see what happens then to these minorities. And you have elements of, for the Chinese, some elements of conversion to a kind of a global Christianity or to a religion as a way of reaffirming an identity vis-a-vis. So insofar as religious identity become one of the almost officially imposed markers that the state uses for the whole people and for the others, then there are dynamics of this kind that is interesting to observe.
And this is also a long-term discussion. As you know, in diaspora studies, the whole notion of strategic essentialism, right, is a central notion that, on the one hand is constricting, as you call it, and I think you're entirely right. On the other hand, it allows for a certain kind of positioning of the minorities vis-a-vis a state. By precisely what Kim was saying, that it allows you to marshal political resources to position yourself vis-a-vis a state that is used to having these ideas of essentialized identities. And so unless you essentialize yourself, creating a kind of pan-ethnic identity, fusing yourself and in a certain sense boiling away difference, then you're not going to have a voice in the public sphere, right? So these things have cut multiple ways.
Josh, did you come up here because you want to weigh in on this?
No, I just wanted to say something as a transition to the next panel when we're done.
Oh, okay. It was this last point. It was interesting. Our first co-sponsored program with Berkeley on migration and religion, Cem Özdemir, who's the first Turkish origin member of the German parliament, was speaking, and he was saying that his biggest frustration is that, particularly since 9/11, he is now always introduced as a Muslim member of parliament, and he doesn't consider himself to have that as his identity, but it's being forced on him. He's perfectly fine with being introduced as the first Turkish origin member, but not the first, not as a Muslim. That if there are no more questions, then we're just about at the break time, but I'll let Josh say something by way of transition.
What you've heard so far is our attempts to synthesize and summarize 3 different types of processes that we've found in the different sites. And what you'll hear after the break from the next panel will be more concrete descriptions of each one of these processes within individual sites. So they'll get the conversation will go from a less abstract and perhaps epistemological sense of what we're talking about to more practiced realities within each site. So understanding better what's happening, what we've been talking about, will be helped by the conversation to follow. And this relationship between synthesizing and concrete research is something that's been going back and forth in our project. And so we invite you to accompany us on the second half of how we work on this.
Then before we break, I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel for very interesting papers.